Good afternoon and welcome back to House Divided, coming to you live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and I am here to introduce you to another one of our authors. And we are going to spend the next hour or so talking about George Rable's new book, fairly new book, Conflict of Command. But if you'll give me just a moment to review, I want to make sure that everything is going according to plan. And it seems to me that it is. So we will plunge straight ahead. Now, as I said before, you are at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop with us virtually. Our show is called A House Divided. And and today we'll be discussing this book, Conflict of Command, with Dr. George Rable. And I'm going to introduce George to you in just a moment. But first, I want you to understand something about this event. This event is a book signing party. We used to have book signing parties in independent bookshops all over the country. I know you've probably done a lot of those, George, where people come and stand in line and you sign the book and they take it away. That's what we're doing today, except you get to meet Dr. Rable and we're going to ask him questions. You're going to get to ask questions if you want. But the most important thing, you get to buy the book. You get to buy a copy of Conflict of Command by George Rable, and Professor Rable has kindly signed book plates for us. So we're going to send you first edition signed books, signed on Abraham Lincoln Bookshop custom book plates. So while you're watching the program, if you think this is an interesting book, go ahead and order it. You can do that at the link that we're going to put in the comments below this live stream. Now, like I said before, you can also ask questions. If you have questions about Abraham Lincoln and George B. McClellan, just ask them by putting the question in the comments section of this live feed on Facebook, and I will ask your questions. If you want to ask all the questions, then go ahead. I'll just read your questions, and I won't worry about all of these questions that I wrote. But we can do that. Now, let me introduce you to our author for today. George C. Rable is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Alabama and the author of numerous books about the Civil War, including Fredericksburg, God's Almost Chosen People, Damn Yankees. I have a couple of those here. I don't have Fredericksburg, but I love this book. I love God's Almost Chosen People, the religious history of the Civil War. And we discussed this on a live stream with George a few years ago when that book first came out. Gosh, was that 2010?
Yeah, about that, I think. Hard to remember.
It was hard to remember, but it was a good book, and we have a copy of it if you want to order that. But the book we are going to talk about today is Conflict of Command. George McClellan, Abraham Lincoln, and the Politics of War. Comes to us from Louisiana State University Press. We have first editions. There are 476 pages. The book is illustrated. There are maps, dust jacket. The cost is $49.95. You could order it and we will ship it right out to you. Let's take a look at that dust jacket because we're probably going to look at that picture again later today, George. Don't you think so?
I think so.
But anyway, that is Conflict of Command. And we are going to revisit a familiar topic, a familiar controversy, but I've read the book and I can tell you we are going to look at it from a totally new point of view. And so let's jump right into discussing Conflict of Command. And George, why did you want to write the next book about Lincoln versus McClellan?
Well, I wanted to undertake a biographical topic of some sort. And I couldn't really come up with a straight biography that I wanted to do, and so I decided to sort of revisit the Lincoln and McClellan relationship. Not exactly a dual biography, but looking at the relationship from both men's point of view.
Mhm.
As you pointed out, this is not a new subject at all.
Right.
It's a very old subject that people have written on endlessly. And so my task was that, okay, what am I gonna say about it? And I decided I was going to tightly focus on the relationship between the two men, uh, on a relationship that I think students of the Civil War have largely made their mind up about, and certainly not in General McClellan's favor for the most part. I think it's fair to say it's not a particularly fashionable topic in the Civil War field right now. But I thought that a focused study looking on the evolution of the relationship, and eventually I decided to focus on the politics of the relationship. I thought it might work. And I emphasize that word might, because I must say, as I worked on this, I was as humble as Lincoln and often as slow as McClellan. Um, and I wasn't sure, a lot of times I wasn't sure what I was doing. I wasn't sure whether this was the right topic. But I slogged along and it took a while and I finished it, and I'm reasonably satisfied with the outcome.
Yeah. Well, we do seem to be, one thing you brought up earlier, we do seem to be in sort of a strange period of Civil War studies. And as a reader of Civil War books for my entire life, one of the things that I've really enjoyed was that for most of my life, Civil War historians have been looking to write new books about new topics that have not been covered before. And that's been a real gold mine as far as I was concerned for my life. But now, as you say, we've got uh, I would say in 2024, there's a real dearth of thinking and writing about topics that used to be very popular. One of them would be Lincoln versus McClellan or the generalship of McClellan. But earlier today, I was looking at a review and uh, at a book review, and the reviewer mentioned in an offhand way that it's been years since anybody wrote a military history of the Peninsula Campaign or histories of those battles.
Yeah. I mean, operational military history has kind of fallen on hard times. I mean, there are still people undertaking it, but
Mhm.
yeah, particularly in terms of academic historians, uh, they are not undertaking such studies.
Right. Well, you wrote the Fredericksburg book, and that
Right.
was a
Yeah.
fantastic book in that it introduced to a lot of people a way that you could approach a battle and still cover issues of social history and cultural history and things like that.
But a young historian now, setting out in academe, writing any kind of operational military history would not probably be a wise choice.
Right.
Get tenure and then do it.
Yeah, yeah. Wait until you can make the call on your own. Okay, well, about the book, in Conflict of Command, the book seems to me to distill its subject into a conflict between two men. And I know a lot of other people are involved in this conflict, but it's a
Right.
conflict between Abraham Lincoln, and George B. McClellan. And so, to what extent were the conflicts over war strategy uh, conflicts between the individuals, Lincoln and McClellan?
I think that's an important part of it, and the fact that this relationship between the two men fails in such a spectacular fashion certainly shapes the course of the war. And you can look at the differences between the two men in terms of background, in terms of temperament, though the thread that I thought really bound them together was the thread of ambition.
Okay.
Both of these men are intensely ambitious. Now, McClellan is very much ambitious for military glory. Lincoln is ambitious, I think, in terms of wanting to save the Union and wanting to have a lasting impact on history. I think Lincoln realized that how central an event the Civil War was. And I think he was very much concerned about how he would be remembered. And even his law partner, William Herndon, wrote on several occasions how deeply ambitious Abraham Lincoln was.
Right. The little engine that knew no rest.
Exactly. And other than and he also wrote something about how Lincoln's ambition sometimes suppressed his finer feelings. And that's not been quoted as often as the little engine, but Herndon made no bones about Lincoln being ambitious. And you can see this. I mean, even after the presidential election of 1864, Lincoln is absolutely obsessed with the returns. He wants to get all the returns from the states, wants to see how he did. So
Yeah.
there's a kind of burning ambition there all along.
Okay. Now, one more way to frame this conversation, and we're going to jump into the details again in a minute, but one way to frame this conversation is any discussion about this conflict always seems to revolve around McClellan as the key person, even though it's a conflict between two
Yes.
people. Uh, Historians have constantly discussed this as being you're either in the pro-McClellan camp or the anti-McClellan camp. And I've never hear anybody talk about being in the pro-Lincoln or anti-Lincoln camp on the
Not usually.
right. So do you feel like at least the historians in the past, do you think they've been on point to focus on McClellan? Or did they need to, or do you feel like you need to broaden the scope and look more at Lincoln?
No, I think you need to look at Lincoln in the relationship too. And I think historians in the past have done that.
Mhm.
But what historians in the past have tended to do is, I think you point out, they've sort of gone into the pro-McClellan camp or the anti-McClellan camp.
Mhm.
Now, the anti-McClellan camp are the giants of Civil War history, right?
Right.
Bruce Catton, my mentor, T. Harry Williams, Stephen Sears, James McPherson, and the more favorably disposed toward McClellan, I think Ethan Rafus's fine study, McClellan's War, which I think is a superb book that
Okay.
I would highly recommend. Uh, and there's some more recent things that try to revise the views of McClellan in particular campaigns and that sort of thing. But certainly the weight of the historians have been in the anti-McClellan camp. My goal was to try to understand the two men rather than getting into an argument, pro or anti.
Mhm.
And I sought to write an even-handed account, and so far, at least the early reviews agree that they think I succeeded in that.
Yeah.
And if somebody is looking for a book that takes a strong argument against either a person, this is definitely not the book for them.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems to be a book that focuses on the conflict, as the title suggests, and not obsessively on one or the other personality.
I think that's true, and also I started out naively thinking, oh, I can dash this off quickly. This will be a short book. The sources are readily available. That sort of thing won't be a problem. But as I got into the study, I decided a couple things. One, that the details really mattered, that looking at how the relationship evolved between the two men and the impact on the war itself, those details mattered a great deal. I also decided that the voices of the press were terribly important, particularly some of the New York newspaper editors like Horace Greeley or James Gordon Bennett. And I also decided that the opinions of the officers and the common soldiers, who had a lot to say about both Lincoln and McClellan, was an important part of the story. And then also, I decided, and this further lengthened the book, I was not going to end it with McClellan's removal from command in November 1862.
Right, right. And indeed, it does go right on through the end of the war, and it does deal with the election, which we'll get to in a later in our conversation. One of the things that I've always noticed about Lincoln that sort of put a grin on my face is he always seems, especially when he's putting a new general in, that he says he wants to leave the military strategy to the generals, and then he doesn't.
Right.
And so, why did Lincoln feel the need to intrude on McClellan's operations?
Well, both Lincoln and McClellan were new to their tasks, as Grant himself pointed out in kind of a defense of McClellan in some ways. And so Lincoln has to learn on the job, as does McClellan to some degree. I think Lincoln learned a lot, evolved a lot better on this than McClellan did, but Lincoln would allow generals to simply ignore the chain of command.
Mhm.
A prime example early on is the conflict between McClellan and the General in Chief of the Army, Winfield Scott.
Mhm.
They clash early on, and Lincoln allows McClellan to really undermine Scott, and eventually, of course, Scott is out, and McClellan becomes General in Chief. Lincoln could also be pretty naive about logistics and geography. Um, he could be very impatient. He could assume that campaigns could be conducted, East Tennessee would be a good example, much more easily than they actually could be conducted. And so both have their faults. And of course, any student of the Civil War can rattle off McClellan's faults, and they are numerous and they are serious. His exaggeration of enemy numbers, his hesitation when the time comes for making a decision, um, his political naivete in many ways, uh, hopeless procrastination and delays. The weaknesses the weaknesses are apparent, but there's also his strengths, his organizational ability, his ability to command loyalty of officers and enlisted men, and the Army of the Potomac.
Mhm.
So it's a mixture, and that's why the relationship between the two unfolds in such a complex way.
Right. They're both learning on the
Yeah.
fly. Well, since we're in the early period of the relationship, I have an artifact that we have here at the shop. And for those who are watching at home, Abraham Lincoln Bookshop is a bookshop, but we are also dealers in artifacts and signatures and autographs, art having to do with Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, and the US presidency. And if you look over my shoulder, I have a brilliantly colored print from early in the war and early in the career of George B. McClellan, or at least in the Civil War career of George B. McClellan. And it's called Equestrian Portraits. Equestrian Portraits of Our Nation's Generals. An interesting item because it is published in 1861, but if you look up here, you'll see a little picture of Edwin Stanton is the Secretary of War. So I think perhaps the publishers of the print got caught by surprise when Simon Cameron got kicked out and Edwin Stanton became the Secretary of War. Let's look at a close-up because the main character is George B. McClellan. So let's say this is January of 1862. The main character is George B. McClellan. Let's take a look at a close-up of the engraving. It is, like I said, it's a beautiful engraving, hand-colored. You see that red and you see that blue and the gold epaulets. But there's McClellan. I think that's the McClellan that the world or the country wants to imagine in 1862, George.
I
And it's pretty heroic.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think we forget at our peril how popular McClellan was um, in the fall of 1861, and certainly by early 1862. Though by early 1862, he's recovering from a bout of typhoid, and you know
Right.
that's an important part of the story too. And to some degree, he's being undermined while he's ill. And of course, the relationship with Stanton sours pretty quickly.
Right. And then one more thing about the print is that I know the people at home cannot see the individual faces of the individual generals here, but just let me assure you of all of the people you see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, probably 20 people there, maybe 3 or 4 of them are still in the story at the end of the war. Down here at the very bottom, we have U.S. Grant, who barely makes it into the print. But up here, it's these are the men in 1862 who are going to save the Union. And it's George McClellan, it's John Pope, it's Ormsby Mitchell, it's General Thomas W. Sherman. The other Sherman does not show up at all in this print. So the print's a great snapshot of what the on to Richmond world seemed to be seeing in January of 1862. These are the men that are going to lead the country to victory, and they didn't.
I think it reminds us too about the dangers of of writing history in terms of hindsight
Yeah.
and assuming that, you know, all of this was somehow worked out, uh, that we know who are going to be the main characters in the story from the outset, and we don't.
No, no, and we have to appreciate that when we're writing it. Yeah, we're not writing backwards from what we know. We're hopefully writing forwards from the primary sources to learn. Uh, Daniel Weinberg has also enjoyed this book a lot. I should have told you that before. Congratulations, George. Our Dan Weinberg, my boss, has enjoyed it, but he wasn't able to be here, but he wanted me to ask a couple questions that he had
Okay.
from the book. And so one of them I'm going to go with right now. And this is a question that Dan asks a lot of authors because it really intrigues him, and it is an intriguing question. Uh, a, a general running for president has to go from being a general to becoming a politician. And a politician thrust into becoming commander in chief, especially in wartime, has to make the opposite transition. So, can you compare how these two men had to learn something that they didn't know within the framework of a president becomes a politician has to think like a general, and a general has to begin thinking like a politician?
Oh, I think that's a fine question, and certainly Lincoln. You can start with Lincoln because he has much to learn uh, about military. You know, something as simple as military terminology and how to communicate with military figures. And we know that Lincoln signed out books on military strategy from the Library of Congress. He studied up, and Lincoln evolves in the sense of developing more confidence in dealing with generals. Early in the war, he could be pretty indecisive. He could be pretty indecisive with McClellan. He lets McClellan proceed on the peninsula with a plan that Lincoln didn't have any faith in, and Lincoln wouldn't have done that later in the war. McClellan never quite learns how to deal with the political aspects of the war. From a very young age, McClellan had come to really, I don't think despise is too strong a word, really despised politicians.
Mhm.
And he believed that the war ought to be conducted by professional military people like himself, who who could sort of blithely ignore political considerations. In fact, when McClellan sets out from the peninsula, he is so relieved to be out of Washington. And not only he's conducting the campaign that he planned, but he is just delighted to be away from the Washington politicians. Um, and McClellan always saw himself as being above politics. And so when he actually runs for president in 1864, he is a diffident candidate, probably one of the worst presidential candidates in American history. He never made that. He never made that. He never made that transition, and he could never understand the political pressures under which Lincoln served and why those had to be taken into account.
Right. Um, Gosh, I was thinking of asking about the some of the battles on the Peninsula campaign, but I think I'm really enjoying our talk about the politics and the conflict. But I want folks to know that George does provide operational chapters that describe McClellan's campaign. So you come away from the book knowing basically, uh, how the battles evolve. It's not just an abstraction that happens off stage.
Well, there's not a whole lot of operational detail there, and there's
Right.
probably not going to be enough operational detail for a lot of readers. One of my good friends who advised me on on this project kept saying, "Well, you need to add a little more, military detail in here." And I did to some degree, but I wanted to maintain the focus on the politics, and I really did not want to refight McClellan's campaigns,
Right.
which had been fought by far abler historians than me.
Right. But then from my point of view, then once we get to the chapter about the Peninsula Campaign, it all leads up to Harrison's Landing and the meeting uh, between Lincoln and McClellan. And so that's what I would like to get some of your thoughts on here, because here McClellan sits down in front of his boss and hands him a letter saying, this is how you should fight the war. And McClellan's arguments are filled with some political pressure
Yes,
that
yes.
Lincoln needs to not follow emancipation. And if he wants to win the war, he needs to make the political decisions that McClellan wants him to make.
Now, today we would see that as somewhat extraordinary for a general to give a president political advice. It wasn't so extraordinary at the time, and even T. Harry Williams, who is certainly a strong critic of McClellan, points out that the famous Harrison's Landing letter was not that unusual sort of thing
Mm-hmm.
at the time. And one of the things that, one of McClellan's problems is he doesn't realize that the military and political are closely connected, and they have to be closely connected. You can't simply separate them, as McClellan thought they could be separated. And I think Lincoln realizes too that the military and political are connected, and certainly Lincoln realizes it in terms of his own political fate and the fate of the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so it's very so that's a really great chapter in the book, a picture of the two of them discussing strategy, and certainly now you see it's within the conflict, within the context of the Emancipation Proclamation, and it clearly seems to be that the two want to do two different things. McClellan really does not want to see emancipation. Maybe he does. Maybe he can't imagine what the war would look like afterward.
Yeah, one of the frustrations I found in doing this, you would think the material on these two individuals is abundant, but there are gaps. There are serious gaps. For example, what does McClellan really think about slavery?
Mhm.
Uh, Relatively little direct evidence. McClellan is no abolitionist. He's not really anti-slavery. He doesn't think emancipation ought to be added to saving the Union as a war aim. He expresses some sympathy when he's in Western Virginia for the plight of the slaves there. But I think McClellan is probably like a fair number of Americans, and we forget about this. He's pretty indifferent to
Mm.
slavery. He's not pro-slavery. He's not anti-slavery. He's pretty indifferent to it. And of course, it's hard to study indifference
Right.
because there simply isn't that much material here. McClellan clearly, embraced the racial views of his time and his class. There's no question about that, but it's not something he has all that much to say about.
Hmm. Okay. Now, one other thing that he had a lot to say about Harrison's Landing was all those reinforcements that he wanted.
Yes. Well, McClellan always wants reinforcements. He
Right.
never he never has he never has enough.
Right.
Uh,
Now, Lincoln said, I know this gets quoted all the time, but Lincoln says that sending McClellan reinforcements is like shoveling fleas across the
yes, yes,
room.
yes, yes.
He won't get them anyway. Do you think Lincoln was on point, or did McClellan actually genuinely feel like he needed 160,000 soldiers to get the job done?
Well, there's the controversy about withholding McDowell's corps
Right.
at early on in the campaign, and the distraction of the conflict in the Shenandoah Valley and how
Mhm.
that was handled. And there's plenty of room to criticize, I think, both Lincoln and McClellan. Um, and every time some troops were detached, McClellan thought, well, the politicians aren't supporting me.
Mhm.
And then when Halleck orders him to withdraw from the peninsula, uh, that just reinforces McClellan's aversion to the politicians.
Mhm.
Lincoln, of course, hopes that Halleck can handle the McClellan problem, and Halleck can't handle the McClellan problem at all,
Right.
much to Lincoln's dismay, much to the dismay of the cabinet.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that brings an entire another character into the story with Halleck, who's
Yes.
someone who comes with a great reputation and never seems to quite live up to it. Um,
Well,
and-
poor Halleck was put in a very difficult situation. Plus,
mhm,
his health wasn't very good.
right. He did
And
make the print. He's over here.
well, that's good. I mean, Halleck's an important figure, and he's a sad figure in many ways in the war. But he certainly was ill suited to deal with McClellan. He really could not handle McClellan, and McClellan really comes to distrust Halleck too,
Mhm.
almost as much as he distrusts Stanton, which is
Okay.
saying something.
Yes. Now the chronologically, this does bring us, and you brought up the issue, brings us to the Bull Run campaign, and you already brought up the issue with McDowell's Corps, um, and but that sort of brings up the next political slash military issue. And last year, uh, Gary Gallagher edited and wrote an introduction to Bruce Catton's Army of the Potomac trilogy, which I think is one of the classic
Sure,
books of,
absolutely.
especially from that period. And one of the things that struck me when I picked up Catton again, and Gary Gallagher, Professor Gallagher noticed it as well, and we discussed it, is that they look at the very, Catton thinks that the very first and most important thing to write about in a history of the Army of the Potomac is McClellan arriving back on the Potomac from Harrison's Landing, not the beginning of the army. To Catton, the story of McClellan in the army starts with the story of John Porter and John Pope at Bull Run. Do you, do you see that based, you don't have to agree or disagree with Catton overall, but Catton thinks that this is probably one of the most important chapters in the history of the Army of the Potomac.
I
McClellan, Pope, and Porter.
I think it is, and it's fascinating. And of course, the question was, and Lincoln suspects this, that McClellan really wanted Pope to be defeated.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't go that far, but certainly Porter and McClellan have nothing but contempt for Pope.
Mhm.
Now, they weren't alone by any means, and John Pope was no giant as a commander by any means. The other thing that happens there is the other context that's important. At this point, Lincoln's cabinet, for the most part, wants to get rid of McClellan. And when McClellan comes back, and in the aftermath of Bull Run, and then Lincoln brings him back, Lincoln kind of tries to deny responsibility for that and says, well, it was really Halleck that made the decision. His cabinet is furious. And there's this sort of round robin that they draft that they want to get rid of McClellan. Now, again, not all of them embrace it. Attorney General Bates won't. Seward sort of plays his own game. I didn't realize when I started out this project how fascinating that Lincoln's cabinet would be in terms of their involvement in the Lincoln-McClellan question. Not
Okay.
only Stanton, but Chase and Bates, Blair and Seward. All of these men have a great deal to say about McClellan. In fact, one of the reasons that Seward comes under such suspicion from the radical Republicans, they thought Seward had protected McClellan. So, that's an important part of the politics too. And in the aftermath of Second Bull Run, here you have McClellan back in command, much
Mhm.
to the dismay of Lincoln's cabinet, maybe to Lincoln's dismay as well, but Lincoln doesn't think he has any choice in the matter.
Right.
And there's rejoicing in the Army of the Potomac when McClellan comes back.
Right.
And that's manifest too.
Do you think that Lincoln had confidence in reinstating McClellan, whether he liked the idea or not? Do you think he had confidence?
Well, he knew what McClellan could do.
Mhm.
He knew that McClellan could get an army ready to fight, but he certainly had doubts about whether McClellan could actually deploy it successfully in battle.
Mm-hmm.
And
Did you get a sense of what Lincoln was thinking during the Antietam campaign?
well, he's very
During those few
impatient.
days?
He's very impatient for news. He's sending McClellan these little telegrams. Any news? Any news? Any news?
Uh-huh.
And of course, he's disappointed when Lee's army's not destroyed.
Right.
Really disappointed when Lee's army's not destroyed. Now, McClellan's conduct of the Maryland campaign is a source of uh, endless controversy. You now have Scott Hartwig's superb 2-volume study.
Yes. Mhm.
And to some degree, McClellan is faring a little better with historians of the Antietam campaign than he used to. Um,
Yeah.
and there's been some revision along those lines. I'm no expert on Antietam by any means, and so I don't really want to get down into the weeds on that. But
Well, right. Yeah, and the writing of Scott Hartwig in those two volumes, I think, sort of makes the point you were making earlier that operational military history is something that someone really needs to focus on that. And if you're going to write about Antietam, it could end up being two huge volumes.
and deserve to be. And I find that
Yeah,
reading Scott's work, they don't seem long to me because they're so good. So
right, right. It's a heavy book, but the pages just keep flying by. It's really well written. Yeah,
and of course the problem with Antietam from Lincoln's point of view is the inability to follow up on the win and the inability to destroy Lee's army. Um, and of course, some historians have thought that McClellan was perfectly satisfied once Lee retreated, that he
right.
thought that was mission accomplished. And I think there's some truth to that. Um, but we also need to remember how difficult it always was for Civil War armies to follow up on victories.
Right. Do you think Lincoln at the time of Antietam was still not appreciating that? Was he still looking it even seems like into the Gettysburg campaign, he's hoping that the battle won will result in the end of the war.
Yeah, he looks for a decisive win.
Mhm.
Ironically, McClellan himself thought that's how the war would end.
A
He
single
thought he
decisive
could
battle.
Yeah, he thought he could, if he could amass a large enough army, get it well trained into the field, that the war could be ended in a single large campaign. He believes
Mhm.
that early in the war, and I'm not sure he ever quite gave up on that idea. But of course, in the aftermath of Antietam, Lincoln has now decided, I think Lincoln has pretty well decided if there's further delay, McClellan has to go. And he's going to wait till the 1862 elections are over. And then, of course, he moves to remove McClellan. But the story's not over then, not
Right.
by any means, because every time the Army of the Potomac falters, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the cries arise, bring back McClellan.
Hmm.
Even in the summer of 1864, there are people in the Army of the Potomac saying, look, we're where McClellan was in 1862.
Right.
How is Grant such a fine general if that's if that's the case? And so I found one of the most interesting parts of the story was what takes place after McClellan's removal from command.
Right, right.
I
And I want to
became
get to that in just a moment, but I do have something else I want to share. And over here, I do have this albumen photograph, Alexander Gardner with Lincoln and McClellan. And let me share it with the folks at home so that, because I know you can't really see it. Uh, but there it is, the beautiful albumen photograph, beautifully framed with probably 4 or 5 different levels of framing, layers of framing. An original albumen photograph of a large size, and there is Lincoln visiting with McClellan in the in at McClellan's headquarters at Antietam. I believe it's at the Pry House. Isn't that what we're looking at behind the the tents there?
That could be.
Yeah, but it's Lincoln meeting with McClellan and his staff. Here we see it's a windy day, so here we see that the let me use my cursor here, that the photographer Gardner has gotten a chair for Lincoln to hold on to, so that the big tall commander in chief doesn't wave back and forth in the in the breeze. Um, but what we're really looking at here, though, and if somebody wants to learn more about this photograph, they can uh, by following a link that we're going to put in the comments. But I'm also going to go back here to your dust jacket because there's a close up of the two men eye to eye, if you will.
Well, not
Not
quite eye to eye,
not
because
quite eye to
Lincoln
eye,
Lincoln
but
towers over McClellan.
would you call this meeting uh, a showdown? I mean, is this really a chance when Lincoln goes out and visits McClellan in the field? Is this a chance for McClellan to make a pitch to continue the war and win it the way he thinks he will? Or is this Lincoln sort of measuring McClellan's coffin?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both.
Mhm,
And the basic problem between the two in some ways was simply a lack of communication.
mhm,
And McClellan tended to keep his plans secret. He played his cards pretty close to the vest, including with some of his own subordinates. And his inability to share important information with Lincoln, I think, was a serious weakness. And Lincoln by this time recognizes this, and Lincoln is there to urge McClellan to move, to take advantage of the victory at Antietam and pursue Lee, and presumably destroy Lee's army.
right.
McClellan is soon going to be complaining about supply problems, horses,
Mhm,
and that sort of thing. And there were some supply problems, and there were some reasons for delay. But Lincoln's patience is very thin at this point, and it's
right.
not going to take much to push him over, particularly once those elections are over and he feels free to move against.
And you do think that he made the decision before the elections and then waited?
I think so. I think
Mhm.
so. I mean, he's a savvy enough political animal, and of course, the elections didn't go very well.
That's right.
They did not go well, and at one point, an irate Republican congressman comes in and says to Lincoln, "It's not your fault we didn't all lose." Uh, you know, and and that's why I think it's so important to remember that both of these men had a bevy of supporters and critics. And I'm sure most Americans don't realize how unpopular Lincoln often was
Yeah.
during his presidency, and how he thought he might well lose in 1864.
Hmm. Yeah, that's true. I have another question that Dan Weinberg has gotten because he was looking very carefully at the Antietam chapter. And so he also asked me to pass this along. So, when writing on Antietam, you say that some in the field thought the government was tying McClellan's hands and not letting him, quote, direct operations as he saw fit, unquote. And in a footnote on the Antietam battle, you quote historian Brooks Simpson as arguing that the Army of the Potomac had absorbed Mac's caution and hesitation, certainly with the government, but also probably on the battlefield. And then finally, in Four Brothers in Blue by Carter, which you have in the bibliography,
Mhm.
either Walter or Bob wrote, quote, why in the name of heaven McClellan did not let our corps finish up the Rebs, and why he did not renew the battle on Thursday and follow speedily across the river, I can't understand, in the quote. So, you, what is your opinion? Dan's asking you, what is your opinion on why McClellan didn't follow up in the days after the battle? Of course, he did cross the river at Shepherdstown, but he really didn't press then, you know?
No, and he was. It seemed like he was going to do that.
Hmm.
It seemed like he was going to do that, but then didn't. Um, I think he doesn't do it in part because the Army had suffered enormous casualties.
Right.
And the difficulties of following up, I don't think should be underestimated. Again, I'm no Antietam expert, but looking at it from McClellan's viewpoint, I can see why he might not have felt he was able to do that. I can also see this from the point of view of Lincoln and from the point of view of critics in the Army of the Potomac that's saying, look, we've won this signal victory. The Confederates have retreated. Let's pursue them.
Hmm.
And I think if you contrast Carter with the idea that the Army of the Potomac was McClellan's, uh, I think the Army of Potomac was McClellan's, but there were still a lot of critics of McClellan in the Army. Really, from
Right.
the peninsula on, there are there are officers and there are enlisted men saying, maybe McClellan's not as good as we thought he was.
Hmm.
Now, obviously, the soldiers like the fact that McClellan is not going to commit them to headlong charges into entrenched positions.
Hmm.
And I think that helps explain his popularity. Plus, McClellan's concern for the material welfare of the soldiers.
Right.
One of the great things about that photograph you showed was not
Mhm.
only the contrast between the appearance of McClellan and Lincoln, but the fact that both men were so visible to people at the time.
Right.
Uh, Not necessarily so much through the circulation of photographs, but simply from the fact that the troops saw both men frequently. There were all these troop reviews that McClellan seemed to like to do endlessly. And soldiers talk about the way the two men looked on horseback and
Hmm.
the contrast. The way the two men looked, they always describe Lincoln as careworn, that it looks
Right.
like the burdens of the world are upon him. And of course, we're very well familiar with how Lincoln's appearance evolves, or I guess you could say devolves during the war,
Right.
how
Hmm.
hard the war is on Lincoln.
And McClellan always seemed to want to live up to that image from the print, the heroic
Yes,
image from the print.
he was a good horseman. He made
Hmm.
a good impression on horseback, and I think he knew that. And he also thought it was important to appear before the troops. He thought it was important to be visible,
Right.
even though he has some skeptical things to say about volunteer soldiers. He doesn't let those opinions out among the men, and so there's deep affection for McClellan in the Army, an affection that survives McClellan's removal from command
Right.
and probably persists up until the presidential election campaign when it fades pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah. And then there was this period, and you had mentioned it before, after his dismissal and before he went into the political arena, that he was uh, like a ghost. He's always just so hovering behind the scene, ready to come back on, or people think he's going to come back onto the scene. In the during the Gettysburg campaign,
Yeah.
Union soldiers are saying, well, they're going to bring it's now that it's a crisis again, they're going to bring McClellan back again, like they did at Antietam.
They're saying he is back.
Oh yeah.
They believe there are rumors that he's back and the men are cheering and that sort of thing. And I also think we forget at our peril that there were some conservative Republicans and maybe even some moderate Republicans that thought McClellan ought to be given some kind of command,
Hmm.
or maybe even made general in chief. You could speculate whether McClellan would have been better as general in chief in Halleck's position than actually commanding an army. But
Right.
that's can't really answer that question. But it's
Right. Yeah, that's a woulda, shoulda, coulda
right.
question. But nevertheless, that does keeping him in the public mind and in the soldiers' minds leads to 1864. And one of your final chapters, you call it the final battle. And that is his campaign for president in 1864. So he does reemerge as hoping to ride that. It seems like hoping to ride that desire for McClellan's return to. I guess the Democrats would like that to become their vehicle for winning the White House.
Yeah, I think that's true, though. McClellan is such a peculiar political candidate. First of all, he's reluctant, and I don't think that was just a show of reluctance. I think he was
Mhm.
genuinely reluctant. At one point, he writes to his mother that he doesn't want to have anything to do with the
Yeah,
presidential contest. And then as a candidate, he doesn't do anything.
right.
Now, I mean, candidates did not campaign on their own behalf at
Mhm.
that time, so he wasn't going to go out and speak in any event.
Mhm.
But he doesn't use his contacts in the army. His New York political advisors say, look, why don't you contact some of the generals, some of the other officers, and sort of drum up support in the army because the soldier vote could be very important. But McClellan doesn't want to do that. In fact, he
Mhm.
says, spare me any more contact with politicians. He just doesn't want to. He just doesn't want to do
Right.
that.
And I've noticed this to some extent. If politicians, if candidates for the presidency in 1860 and 1864 didn't do campaigning, which is true, they didn't go out and give stump speeches and so on and so forth. But the one thing that is ubiquitous about all political candidates is the campaign biography and the millions of copies of something
Yeah.
published by their friends, Lincoln and Hamlin,
Yeah.
or anything like that. And what, correct me if I'm forgetting something, but what you really see in 1864 for McClellan is a sort of rehashing of his military campaigns and his military conflicts by his military allies.
Yeah. What they use as campaign documents are the Harrison's Landing letter
Yeah,
and a speech he delivered at West Point in 1863, if I remember
right.
correctly, the year. And of course, you have the anomaly
Mhm.
of McClellan being nominated on a platform that declares the war a failure.
Yeah,
And then McClellan cannot stand by the platform. His letter accepting the nomination basically, when it comes down to it, rejects the platform. And there's a wonderful print of McClellan being pulled in two different directions by horses.
yeah,
Yeah. And the Peace Democrats got the platform and they didn't get the candidate. And so it was a sort of bifurcated contest, and that platform so alienates the soldiers.
right.
Men who had deep affection for McClellan and had for some time say, okay, that's it. If that's the Democratic platform, we cannot support McClellan. And they're concerned that McClellan had gotten connected to some dirty politicians.
Yeah.
He'd been dragged into the into the muck of the political arena, and they are disappointed. They are
Right.
disappointed in McClellan.
Well, I want to show off something else that we have that is a relic, an artifact of the 1864 campaign, and that are these soldier election ballots uh, that were used in the field. And the 1864 campaign was one of the first elections where the soldiers in the field could could vote from some states.
Yes,
A lot of
right.
states didn't. Our ballots are from the state of Michigan, and let's take a close-up look at it and see. That's very interesting there. In that, what the ballot does is it clearly asks, tells the person who's going to use it, cross out all of the
Right.
communities in your district that you're not from. So this is definitely a Michigan soldier from Madison who is going to use this ballot to vote for Lincoln. And this is the Lincoln Johnson. You can see here, this is the Lincoln Johnson ticket. The Union Party, of course, we have to remind people that every now and again, the Republicans rebranded themselves for one election. Um, and so tell us about, you've already introduced the idea of the importance of the soldier vote and how it went against McClellan. What's the importance of that soldier vote, the voting from the field? Was that decisive, you think, in the 1864 campaign?
I don't think most historians think it was decisive.
Mhm.
I think one of the things we forget is it looks like a landslide
Right.
in terms of the Electoral College and popular vote. But as a couple of historians have pointed out, if you change just a few thousand votes in a half a dozen states that were very close, including New York,
Hmm.
It could have come out the other way. Now, obviously, people are voting party. This is a period of intense party loyalty. Um, there's not a whole lot of ticket splitting um,
Hmm.
uh, at this time. Um, and I think some of McClellan's political advisors were telling him he might win, which of course was not true, and they shouldn't have they
Yeah.
shouldn't have advised him
Hmm.
about that. How hard McClellan took the defeat is difficult to say. He appears not to have taken the defeat that hard, and
Hmm.
soon resigns from the army and takes his family to Europe. Um, but Lincoln, of course, was intensely interested in what was going on, including badgering officials after the election for detailed returns from the states,
Hmm.
because Lincoln had tried to handicap the election up to almost the eve of the election. And you can find in Bassler's collected works of Lincoln his estimates of how he was going to do.
Yeah.
And at times he thought it was going to be extremely close in the Electoral College.
Sure.
And in the summer of 64, people were telling him he was going to lose.
Yeah. Of course, he wrote that letter, the blind letter to
The
the.
famous blind memorandum, but
Yeah.
thanks to Sherman and Phil Sheridan
Hmm.
and those victories in the fall, that boosts him over. But
Right.
as I said before, you need to remember how controversial and unpopular Lincoln was
Right.
at the time
Hmm.
as well. And I think simply holding a presidential election in the midst of a civil war is an amazing accomplishment.
Right.
If you want an additional reason to be proud of the American Republic, think of actually holding the election of 1864,
And yeah, and having it go through. Yeah.
an election in which both men were going to abide by the results of the election.
Right.
There was never any question. There was never any question about that. And though some people thought McClellan was disloyal, I don't think Lincoln thought McClellan was disloyal.
Right. And certainly having McClellan in a position to lose the election and continue with peaceful transfer of power and never have a second thought about you know about adjudicating the election
Right.
after it was over. He lost and he went to Europe.
Yeah. Yeah, he did.
Now, we don't have too much time, but as I asked before we started, we tend to, well, these are fun conversations. So if you have a few more minutes, one
Sure.
thing that I wanted to get to was the memory of McClellan over the generations. Now, we could have spent the entire hour talking about the different schools of thought on
Right.
McClellan, but I really want to go straight to this book behind me, McClellan's own story. And this is what we get as far as a memoir of McClellan. But one of the first things that you write in Conflict of Command is that you discuss this book, this memoir of McClellan, and you have some opinions about why it doesn't seem to do McClellan many favors.
Well, it's not McClellan's own story. In some
Yeah.
ways, the title is misleading. McClellan didn't live to finish it, and his literary executor, W.C. Prime, hardly helped matters by bringing the partially completed manuscript into print and then adding excerpts from the letters between McClellan and his wife, Mary Ellen Marcy McClellan,
Right.
that have really offered fodder for McClellan critics ever since. And those letter excerpts are remarkable in many ways.
Right.
Now, McClellan labored along on this memoir. In 1881, he'd largely completed it, put it in a warehouse because he was going to travel, and there was a fire and
Hmm.
destroyed the manuscript. So he started anew rather slowly. And when he died in October 1885, this new manuscript had only reached May 1862.
Right.
And so W.C. Prime basically put in stuff from McClellan's 1864 report on his military operations and sort of wrapped it up. So it's really not McClellan's book. it would have been neat if we'd have known what McClellan would have written about all of these points of controversy after May 1862 about the
Mhm.
Peninsula Campaign, withdrawal from the Peninsula, his return, the conduct of the Maryland Campaign, his removal from command. I'd have loved to have heard what he had to say about the cries to bring him back and also about the election of 1864. So, with that book, you have to sort of think about what's not in there. Now it's still a valuable book. It's a
Yeah,
very valuable book.
it does have his thoughts on some things.
There are insights. There are early accounts of some of his meetings with Lincoln, for which he is the only source. There's also accounts of his meeting with Republican senators that from early on did not go well, and you can see in McClellan's book why he had political difficulties.
Yeah,
Because he tells Republicans in the fall of 1861 that he's not fighting for either emancipation or the Republican Party.
yeah.
So yeah, that gets him in trouble. But it's just too bad that the original manuscript was destroyed. That's a tragedy.
Right.
I have my own copy of the book, which I've had for many years,
Oh, good.
which I found at a book sale. I think it's a similar edition to what
Yeah,
you
that's
have.
the first edition. That's
Yep.
the Charles Webster
Yeah, it's
Company edition.
mine is not mine's in okay shape, but the pages are loose. But it's yeah, I've used it. I won't say I've worn it out, but I didn't find it as useful as I'd hoped probably beginning the project because I was pretty naive because I didn't know about much about what was in there and Stephen Sears has written great things about how it was produced and
Yeah.
what was in there and what wasn't. Has a wonderful article on that subject.
Mhm. I guess the only other thing about the books that I have to share, and we don't this one doesn't even require a whole lot of discussion, but for fast forward to 1916, here we have James Havelock Campbell, writing McClellan, and no reason to handicap this book, say whether it's good or bad or indifferent. But the interesting thing is, by 1916, Campbell, writing on behalf of the Neal publication, Walter Neal, um, uh, is writing a very uh, pro McClellan uh, version of his biography, and going as far as quoting as an authority that the German general Helmuth von Moltke had said that if Lincoln had followed McClellan's advice, he would have won the war a lot sooner. That certainly puts the Campbell's book in a time and place. I don't think he would have written that after 1917, leaning on German generals
Yeah,
for the
yeah,
genius of George
right.
McClellan.
But I mean, that just shows that there have always been McClellan defenders, and there
Mhm.
remain McClellan defenders to this day.
Mhm.
Um, and in some cases, they're defending him on the basis of conduct in particular campaigns, the Maryland campaign or the Peninsula. And in other cases, I simply think that the historiography has been too unbalanced and too pro Lincoln.
Mhm.
But I tried to write a balanced account. I think I achieved that, probably too balanced for some taste. But you
Mhm.
know, I don't think we'll ever be quite done with Lincoln and McClellan as long as people care about the American Civil War.
Right.
I that I think there's still going to be people writing about this, maybe taking some new angles. One of the things I didn't do that I think would be interesting, maybe not for a book, but maybe something shorter,
Mhm.
is looking at how Confederates evaluate McClellan,
Ah.
not only during the war but after the war. And some of them think he's a fool, some of them think he's a capable general. They like his conservatism. They like his conservatism a great deal and his
Mhm.
respect for Confederate property, his conservatism on slavery. They admire that, but there's some work that could be there's some work that could be done there.
That would be interesting. Now, to wrap the book, one of the things, in the last couple of pages that you write brings us back to one of the things we talked about at the beginning, which is we have a problem, or you faced a problem of writing a balanced analysis of the conflict versus the stories that we like to tell ourselves about the Civil War. And certainly when you look at Lincoln and McClellan, it's always going to be, or has up to this point, has always been the story of the martyr versus the foil.
Yes.
So no matter what you look at in the conflict, one of these guys is going to end up being the martyr of the Republic, and the other guy is going to be the other guy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's been the way it is. And in some ways, I give a talk in the book, and the title of the talk is Set in Stone.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's how the story of Lincoln and McClellan has somewhat been done. I mean, people, okay, Lincoln, the great commander in chief, McClellan, the dawdler, the complainer, the whiner, the overrated general that frustrates Lincoln to no end. And as the late great historian Reed Mitchell said one time, Civil War people like to hear the same stories told in exactly the same way. And to some degree, Ken Burns did that,
Mm-hmm.
offering very conventional views of Civil War generals. Um, and I understand that people want to hear the story that they know, and it sort of reinforces what they already think.
Yeah.
Um, and I like myself, I kind of like new approaches and new things, and not to dismiss, certainly not to dismiss what's been done, because if you look at the work that's been done on Lincoln and McClellan, done by
Mm-hmm.
some of the finest historians that have ever written about the American Civil War,
Right.
and whose work should still be valued and is valued.
Mm-hmm.
I think of my mentor, T. Harry Williams' book, Lincoln and His Generals, which I think remains a great book,
Yeah.
and is actually not as critical of McClellan as you would think. Harry's lectures on McClellan were always very critical. His
Uh-huh.
book was a lot more nuanced than that, but he's clearly not in the pro-McClellan camp.
Right. Well, thank you very much, George, for joining us. And before I do the wrap up, is there anything you're working on now that you want to let us know about?
Yes, I've been working on this for probably several decades off and on. It's a study I call The Promised War,
Okay.
on what Americans thought the war was doing to them at the time and what the war was going to do to themselves and the country. Hopes, expectations, fears, predictions, that sort of thing.
That sounds fascinating. I can tell that that's a big project.
It's gonna be hard to get a handle on it. It's probably just about as amorphous as it sounds,
Yeah.
but the material is wonderful. I'm having great fun doing it. It'll be a while. I haven't even come close to start writing yet. My wife was asking me about this today. Maybe in a couple years, I'll be actually writing on it.
Well, if
So
you need a copy of equestrian portraits of our nation's generals as a snapshot of what people thought in January of 1862, you can have that.
well,
Well,
that might be a good subject for a book.
yeah,
What people thought would be the great generals of the war at certain times.
yeah,
They can get that wonderful print and then write the book.
right. Yeah, the popular culture artifacts are going to tell you what people thought
Right,
more than the backward focused history
right.
on it. So thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you again very soon on House Divided, and have a wonderful day.